Having true interdisciplinary and cross-species kinds of gatherings are rare and special. So I'm really thankful for being here and looking forward to learning from you throughout this. So my lab, as Laura was saying, focuses on both vocal learning and communicative development in both songbirds and human infants. So the upper floor of the lab is babies and the lower floor is birds. And our central findings show that young birds and babies both are very good at learning new vocal forms, but mostly when social responses to their immature vocalizations are contingent and close in time. We'll be looking at some of the data on that today. And so immature sounds, whether it's babbling in babies or plastic song in songbirds, though they're kind of acoustic garbage, they have real fundamental functional significance when you study them in social context, and that's the key. So understanding the social functions of babbling can give us insights into underlying mechanisms of vocal learning. Now, that means we got to focus on simpler processes to figure out, how over developmental time, more complex, more adaptive outcomes become elaborated. So there's actually lots and lots of good examples of complex social behavior, adaptive complex social behavior, arising out of simpler processes. So for example, these rat pups who are born blind and deaf, they can huddle to collectively thermoregulate. They actually meet a thermal challenge that would quickly kill any individual pup. Flocks of birds and shoals of fish, such as these starlings and these surgeonfish, they engage in collaborative foraging and really fast and adaptive anti-predator avoidance behavior. Now, what all three examples have in common is that the interactions between individuals are local. There's no centralized executive controller. There's no king rat pup or queen starling going on here. And the individuals don't contain a blueprint for the group adaptive behavior. Okay, the individual behavior is not isomorphic with the group behavior, and that's an important point that we're going to come back to in the development of communication. So my work is assessing the role of simple, very local kind of interactions among individuals in the service of building complex and adaptive communicative systems. So we're going to look at small behaviors at small time scales to get a handle on this. So we'll start off with social functions of babbling, and we want to know what aspects of immature vocalizing actually engages caregivers, and what do people do when they react to babbling? Does it influence the structure of parental speech, both in terms of the suprasegmental or prosodic features and in terms of the linguistic structure? And if so, what are the implications for learning? So this work actually got its start in studies of brown-headed cowbirds, my graduate work at Indiana University with Meredith West and Drew King. I'm going to not talk about that now, but I think we'll talk about it during the panel discussion, so someone remind me. We'll start off with the infants, and then we'll move over to some of the zebra finch work. So I want to give you some details of vocal development over the first year so we can see what parents actually have to work with here. So let's just let the baby speak for itself. This is a 9-month-old female in my lab with mom. And what you'll hear is that early vocalizations are very creaky and nasal. Okay, a few things to notice. We'll have to jump back and forth there. Thanks. The early sounds, they don't sound like adult speech. They're called quasi-resonant vocalizations or protophones. There's a real lack of consonant vowel alternation. What's also interesting is if you took this apart frame by frame, you would see that the caregiver's responses are quite rapid, and they're actually well synchronized with the infant sounds. The baby interrupts mom, but the mom doesn't interrupt the baby. It's also fun to watch you guys watching the video because everyone starts smiling, especially once the baby starts babbling more, people start smiling, there's a little bit of leaning. There's no baby in this room, okay? This is a potent stimulus. And that's something we'll talk about. Now I'm going to move forward in time. We're going to look at a 10-month-old here. This baby's vowels take advantage of the upper vocal tract. And these are sounds that could be in a word. Okay, so we've got consonant vowel alternation, mom's responding contingently to the sounds. And so there's a huge amount of acoustic remodeling throughout this period, which is something we'll take a look at. So we need to study both the parents' responsiveness during this first year and infant vocal learning together. It's a co-evolved and co-developing system in my view. So we'll start with parents' responses to babbling. And so to understand the structure of social interaction around a baby who's vocalizing, we use playback paradigms. And what we find, to sum up a whole lot of work we've done on this, is that caregivers of prelinguistic infants, usually 9-month-olds, show significant agreement when reacting to very brief 5-second video and audio clips of unfamiliar infants. So with my student Rachel Albert, we found that more speech-like sounds as they go from to ah and from bleh to ba. That's data in my lab, okay? As they get more mature sounding, what we find is that they get stronger responses from adults, and more caregiving experience actually predicts selectivity of responses, which is a hypothesis we got from studies of brown-headed cowbirds. Immature females tend to be very responsive to even immature male song, but as the females get more mature, these are cowbirds, and develop better song preferences, they get much more selective about what they'll react to in the males. And what we see over the first year is human caregivers getting more selective in their responsiveness to the babbling of babies, so versus non-parental adults or very inexperienced caregivers. So in a series of new studies, and this is a graphics tablet where moms can click to get closer or farther to the babies, or they can click to interact more or less. And that's how we assess responsiveness there. We also have a series of new studies led by Emma Murugara, a graduate student. We're using a virtual reality environment with a virtual baby, and in control conditions, virtual dogs and virtual birds and virtual robots, so we can assess how parents perceive the world around a baby. And for time, I'm going to skip the details of these, but we have a ton of data. We have 3 new publications out on this in the last, I don't know, month and a half, and I'm happy to talk about that later. So what I also want to look at is some work. One of these papers just came out again about 2 weeks ago with Stephen Elmlinger, who's now a postdoc at Princeton, looking at the linguistic structure of parental speech that's either contingent or not contingent on babbling. So what we did in the first study is we had about 30 dyads of 9-month-olds. They came in, just a 30-minute unstructured play session. It's really key when you're doing this kind of work to have a big room. And that allows babies to get distal from caregivers, so they're not locked into a social interaction. There's toys in there. There's also, of course, lots of sensors. My favorite kind of baby is a heavily instrumented baby. And, so we got wireless mics, we got movement sensors, we've got multiple remote-controlled cameras. But from the parent's point of view, it looks like a big playroom. And so what we did here is that we took parents' speech, and utterances from parents were categorized as contingent if they occurred within 2 seconds of baby's vocalizations. All other parent utterances were non-contingent. And then we looked at the structure of their speech. Now, many of you are familiar with infant-directed speech. When you walk up to a baby, you don't say, "Hi, infant, what are you doing?" Okay, that's weird. You would be like, "Hi, what are you doing?" Right? We use a sing-song speech. Interestingly, both contingent and non-contingent speech, again, contingent is on babbling, have very similar acoustic characteristics. A min and max fundamental frequency are pretty much the same with contingent and non-contingent speech. The maximum and the standard deviation, which is a measure of fundamental frequency modulation, are pretty much the same. So that's telling us that the speech to babbling and at other times are acoustically similar, but linguistically, they're very, very different. So what we did is we looked at contingent and non-contingent speech in terms of the number of unique words, significantly fewer in contingent speech. We looked at the mean length of utterance in words, again, significant shorter length of utterances in contingent speech. And we looked at proportion of single word utterances, and those are significantly higher proportion of very simple one-word utterances, again, when speech is in response to babbling. So what we see is this pattern of simplification of linguistic structure across the board. We think that's a really interesting finding, that a baby, by babbling, can simplify his or her language environment. And we know that this simpler kind of speech makes statistical learning of regularities in syntax easier. Basically, it's making language learning easier. So they can create a simplified language learning environment for themselves by vocalizing at adults. So then we looked at this across languages. We use transcripts of naturalistic play from the Childers data set to create a cross-cultural corpus of speech to infants and children. Most of these language samples are from what we call weird cultures. That means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But we actually got a non-weird culture in there, and that's Seltal Mayan. This is basically a subsistence farming community in South America. Children are considered to be stoic members of society. They're not typically spoken to that extensively. And in fact, if you look at child-directed versus adult-directed speech from caregivers in Seltal Mayan, you can't hear the difference. So as a non-native speaker, you would not hear prosodic characteristics that differentiate child-directed from adult-directed speech. And that's true with acoustic analyses as well. However, it turns out they also linguistically simplify their speech when it's contingent on babbling. And this is an important lesson. In fact, here's the cross-cultural data in a nutshell. Not every culture does all three characteristics, but except for Mandarin, most of them do most of them. So again, speech that is temporally organized around immature vocalizing is simplified in linguistic structure, even when the acoustic characteristics of infant-directed speech are not present. And this is an important lesson. By understanding potential learning mechanisms on the part of the infant, statistical learning from simplified syntactic regularities, we were able to look for evidence for that information in the social world around the baby, as organized by the baby's own utterances. If you just went in there with a microphone, pointed it at parents and infants, and listened for what's obvious to adults, which are the prosodic characteristics, you would miss this really important kind of data that babies can gather for themselves by babbling. Okay, so our findings suggest that babbling might function to organize the social environment to create learning opportunities for infants, and we think that babbling may function to change the linguistic structure of parental speech so it's more likely to contain simplified and more learnable information that highlights language structure. We're really interested in this in our work in zebrafinch. We'll be coming to that in a little bit. So we also want to know, though, whether babies care. Okay, so yeah, sure, adults might change the reactions around infants. Does it do anything for infants? So we've been doing this for a long time. We've found several positive impacts of parental responsiveness to babbling on early language development, also with pre-linguistic language learning. We experimentally manipulate parental responsiveness, and I'll show you how we do that in a few minutes. It shows us that the development of more complex and more mature vocalizing, even the learning of word-object associations, it's all facilitated by contingent responding to babbling. It turns out that if you take, well, here's some novel objects. Here we go. I have props. Well, they look kind of similar. But let's say you give one to the baby. 40 seconds later, you take it away. You give them a new one. You do this for 12 objects. And all of these objects, because the babies only had them for about 40 seconds, got equivalent amounts of looking and handling. However, only some of those objects receive babbling, and it's different objects for different babies. What you then do is you take the object that received the most babbling and an object received the least or no babbling, and you make a distorted version of that object, and you put them up on a screen. Babies look significantly longer at the distorted version of the object if it had received the highest amount of babbling. Babies that when you do that with an object that didn't receive babbling, they look at the distorted and the non-distorted ones equally. So the idea is that when a baby's vocalizing at an object, they're gating their own arousal levels and they're doing better visual learning of the features of those objects. There's work on this by Meifeng Chang in ringdoves, and there's also some work on this in dogs. So we also took this to word learning and found similar effect. The idea is that babbling might be the acoustic version of a furrowed brow. It's something that's indicating interest, high arousal, and focused attention. And what's great is that it causes social partners to provide information at exactly the right moments for babies to learn it. Why in the world does that work so well? So the idea is that vocal exploration is uncovering regularities in one's actions on the world. The idea is exploration leads to learning. And this is an idea that comes from curiosity-driven learning. This is from robotics, Pierre-Yves Oudéa in France, and also Celeste Kidd and Jackie Gottlieb in the US. What people have found is that you see more looking there we go, to events of intermediate predictability. So let's say we're talking about objects popping out of boxes. This is a study on human infants. If it's random objects popping out of the boxes, it's noise. Babies don't look very long. If it's always the same objects popping out of the boxes, babies don't look very long. Okay, either way, your learning's at a plateau. However, if it's intermediate, if it's somewhere that's going to drive changes in prediction accuracy. In other words, if it's intermediate predictability, the more you look, the more you learn. Your prediction accuracy improves. Well, that seems to drive looking. And this is a notion known as learning progress, where learners are actually monitoring increases in their prediction accuracy. And this is kind of integrating attention and learning. So the idea is that low predictability, so it's random, you don't increase your learning progress. High predictability, learning progress is high, but it's not increasing. It's plateaued at either end. It's only in the intermediate amount of predictability that you see this increase in learning progress. Again, the more you look, the more you learn. So the take-home message here is that the presence of reliable structure in the environment can shape both the visual and the vocal exploration of young learners. Again, most of this has been guided by computational learning and robotics. It's been rarely tested in human infants. The idea then is that social partners are probably just another kind of semi-predictable statistic in an infant's world, at least in the beginning. Infants are actively foraging for and exploiting those regularities. Think about it. If I babble, I'm a baby, I babble, and there's a bright light, that's kind of salient. There's trees, well, it's not very windy, but let's pretend the trees are blowing in the wind, so there's some movement. Let's say a cat walks by. Now you have some biological animacy. My vocalizing doesn't change any of that, but it'll change you. It'll make you change the predictable structure of your actions. It'll make you a little more predictable, and that's the only thing that's going to drive my learning progress in a natural world. So the idea, the theory, is that contingent responses by social partners should actually drive information gain on the part of the infant. And it turns out that our baseline rates of contingent reacting to infant vocalizing is around 50 to 60%, which is exactly in the sweet spot of Celeste Kidd's studies using non-social stimuli. So we're testing this idea in several ways across multiple paradigms. I'll show you one of our examples. Oh yeah, contingency is data for babies. That's the idea. So what we do, and again, this is based on work we've done in Songbirds, is we'll ask if babies can use social feedback to guide vocal repertoires, and we're looking at this in real time. So they come in for one visit. This is just a 30-minute familiarization period. Lets them just get used to the room. Then they come back the second day, and that's when we do the manipulation. So 10-minute baseline period, they hang out and they play. Then we have manipulations of contingency. And I'll show you how we do that in a minute. We also have yoked controls. This is the other nice thing about talking to people who study animal behavior. I don't have to explain the word playback. I don't have to explain yoked controls. I've had moments at infancy conferences, people are like, they thought I invented yoked controls. And while it's so tempting to be like, why, yes, it's just, it illustrates why this conference is so important. We're very siloed, not just in our thinking, but in our training, and that inhibits discoveries. And so by coming together, we can try to break those silos down. We are very, very good at taking the world apart, but we're not so good at putting it back together again. And that's really our job. Okay, so then we'll have a second baseline, and where we again go back to typical levels of responding. We analyze the rate, the resonance, the consonant vowel articulatory timing, and the phonological structure of babbling in each of these periods. Here's a view of this. Mom's wearing a set of wireless headphones, and that's so I can give her instructions. Now we use earbuds. And that's so I can give her instructions in a way that won't disturb her infant. There's no speaker on the wall with the voice of God coming over, providing confounds. Babies wearing a little wireless microphone, and in some of our studies are wearing additional sensors as well. And so we can get really high quality recordings of the infant's vocalizations. So, as I said before, we're changing the timing of mom's responsiveness. So I instruct each contingent mom to respond to babbling by smiling, getting closer to and touching her infant. They don't know this is about babbling. What I tell her is, I'm going to say a funny word in your headphones while you play. When you hear that funny word, say it to your baby. While you smile, touch them, just let them know it made a difference. The rest of the time, just keep playing. So we're just adding a little something here. But we need to separate the effects of stimulation that's caused by responses to contingencies or contingent responses, we need to separate that from arousal that's caused by her actions. How do you know that just poking the baby isn't going to do this? So that's why we have yoke controls. So it's the same form, the same timing of responses. We have to run a contingent mom first and a contingent baby first so we can get the response schedule. And then we simply use that. So our yoke control baby gets the same amount of stimulation. It's just not synchronized with their babbling. Okay. So we've done a whole series of these studies. We found that contingent interaction facilitates real-time acoustic changes in babbling, and depending on what we're doing, it tends to move sounds towards mature forms. Contingent but silent responding results in increases in more advanced sounds. We get more fully resonant vowels, we get more complex syllables, and we get more what we call canonical syllables. A canonical syllable is a consonant-vowel transition that's under 300 milliseconds and is basically adult-like in its structure. However, if moms respond to babbling with speech, what we find is that babies learn the sound order. They learn the phonological speech patterns of the mom's speech. So if we give babies vowels as feedback, they increase the proportion of fully resonant vowels in their babbling. If we give them words or consonant-vowel structured syllables, babies will significantly increase the proportion of consonant-vowel structured syllables in their babbling. This is all happening on a 10-minute time scale. Okay. So really importantly, the babies aren't using the same phonemes as mom. If mom says bye, babies don't say bye, but they will be more likely to use a consonant vowel structured babble. Even if those individual phonemes are in the infant's repertoire, they're not learning by imitating. They're learning by identifying underlying phonological patterns. But to really test that, what we need to do is find a way to give them a novel phonological pattern, not just a vowel or a consonant vowel that they've been hearing for months. So here's what we did. We presented sound patterns from a Nigerian language, Yoruba. Yoruban words typically have a vowel consonant vowel syllable structure. Those infants by 9 or 10 months, their early disyllables, they're not gaga or baba, they're aba and aga. Vowel consonant vowel. So we know the babies are capable of doing it. They don't typically do this in an environment where the ambient language is English. So what happens if we use these as the example? And these are new data that I'll show you. I'm going to play you a video. You're going to hear 3 Yoruban utterances. The baby just babbled. The experimenter cues mom. You'll hear what mom does. You'll hear what baby does. Okay, and luckily, I'm giving you a workout. Luckily, I didn't have to cherry pick this. This is the kind of thing that happens. The babies start to produce the same underlying vowel consonant vowel form, but not with the same phonemes as mom's speech. So with this study, and we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive here, we had different kinds of contingent input conditions. Again, we're looking for that sweet spot of intermediate predictability. So if this is a statistical learning mechanism and we give them different Yoruban words each time, so the surface features are different, but the underlying regularity is the same. If you learn by statistical learning, you should be able to extract that underlying regularity. However, if you're learning by mimicry, this should be impossible because the surface features change for every word. We also gave them the same Yoruban word each time. This is a different group of babies. And in this case, if it's statistical learning, that would be very challenging. It would be like trying to learn what a chair is by only seeing examples from these red chairs in the room. You wouldn't be able to separate the surface features from the underlying regularities. However, if you're mimicking, this should be pretty easy. It's very, very predictable. So we have an intermediate predictable condition, and we have a highly predictable condition. And we also ran yoke control groups for both of these, so we had an unpredictable condition. Here's what happened. Here we go. This is the high variability, actually really intermediate variability condition. This is the mean proportion Yoruban phonological structured babbles, so vowel consonant vowel babbles on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have our 10-minute baseline, the social response period, that's where we do the manipulation, and then a second baseline period. And what you can see is we get a significant increase in the proportion of those vowel consonant vowel sounds in the social response period. When we give them the same word every time, we get noise, but we don't get a pattern of learning. And when we give them yoke controls, we get some variability, but again, no pattern of learning at all. Here's an easier way to see the same data. This is just a direct comparison across conditions. This is the mean change from the first baseline to the social response period, again, in the proportion of babbles that had that Yoruban vowel consonant vowel form. Only the infants in the high variability condition, which I'm calling as high variability to separate it from 0%. But the reality was, when we went back and analyzed it, this is really in the sweet spot. This is actually an intermediate variability condition. We're now doing graded variants of this with many, many different levels of variability to get a handle on whether or not it's thresholded or whether or not it's gradual as a function of the learning progress curve in the babies. But you can see pretty obviously that it needs to be contingent and it needs to have variability in the input to drive learning. So we then asked if babies were learning by imitating, even in that variability condition. The answer was no. What we did is we just paired mom's Yoruban exemplars with the infant vocalization that then followed. That was over 1,200 pairs, and we shuffled them to make a chance distribution, and we found that we didn't see matching any greater than chance. So this is telling us that babies are learning this pattern, and they are generalizing it to organize new utterances that they're making in their babbling at these 9-month-olds. So now we're running 25, 50, and 75% variability groups to get a better understanding of how variability in this socially guided input can result in infant learning. Okay, and we'll show you some bird versions of this in a minute. We call this socially guided statistical learning. The infants pick up on underlying regularities or high probability patterns in the input, but they are not picking up on the surface characteristics of phonemes. It's not how they're learning here. And this is an interesting difference. A lot of studies of cultural transmission in animal behavior focuses on imitation. But imitation, in my view, and I'd love to talk about this later, imitation, in my view, is not a mechanism. It's an outcome. It simply describes that my behavior is like your behavior, and you can get there a lot of different ways. So that's an interesting difference in the animal behavior to human fields that's worth comparing some more and refining. I think it's an area where we can all make a difference. Okay, so we know we need timing because yoke controls, just who get the same amount of stimulation, don't learn, and we know that contingency matters too. We're also investigating infants' production of sequences of syllables, and we're finding similar kinds of events. So, to sum up, we see this feedback loop here. Years of studies in my lab and others, like Anne Lorlemont's, are showing us that the reactions of caregivers to babbling gives babies opportunities to learn more advanced sound patterns. So the playback studies show us that caregivers are highly responsive to babbling, and that vocalizations that are more fully resonant or that have canonical syllables are really driving are really more strongly influencing the behavior of caregivers. What's neat now that we know, what I just showed you, is that as caregivers react, babies are modifying their sounds. And they're modifying their sounds to become more like the mature utterances. So they're doing it in ways that, in my playback studies, make caregivers more likely to react in the first place. So as this feedback loop continues, it's giving babies structured feedback for their vocalizations, feedback that's influencing in real time and developmental time the acoustic structure of their babbling. So, what's going on here under the hood? We think that certain characteristics of interaction, like infant-directed speech, simplified syntax, and contingent timing, are more predictable and they're more rewarding to infants. There's work by Jackie Gottlieb on non-human primates, she's at Columbia, showing that reward pathways can mediate the saliency of information that's associating with a rewarding interaction. And remember, reward here is not the classical extrinsic reward. Good job, kid, here's an M&M. That's not what's going on here. This is intrinsic reward. This is a baby monitoring, again, this is a theoretical claim, this is a baby monitoring its own prediction accuracy. And there's evidence showing that there is cortical, thalamic basal ganglia cortical dopaminergic circuitry that's activated in those moments of increased prediction accuracy. So we have a prediction reward circuit. There's work by Jesse Goldberg at Cornell and Vikram Gadekar at Columbia showing in zebrafinch that reward circuitry is active during vocal learning. They're focused on a bird matching its own internal template. I'm interested, though, in the information, not just what's in the bird's head, but what the bird's head is actually in. Okay, there's an external feedback loop here going on alongside this internal feedback loop. So we've been looking at this in the zebrafinch. As you guys know, this is a widely studied model species for the neurobiology of song learning, and there's actually a lot of good reasons to suspect that real-time social guidance of vocal learning is going on with this species. They're socially gregarious. Song is really important in female attraction. We know that learning is more effective from live tutors than from tape tutors. We know that juveniles have a preference to learn their father's song. So if you actually go out to Fowler's Gap in Australia and look at this beautiful field site, what you see is that zebrafinch have very synchronized breeding. It's during the monsoon season where there's high humidity, there's water, there's lots of vegetation. So from a juvenile bird's point of view, you're in a nest, in a shrub, you might have up to 40 nests in close proximity. There's a lot of singing going on, but even with multiple adult males nearby, the song you learn is that of dad. In a lab, if you switch the dads, they'll just learn the song of the new tutor. So it's flexible there. Vocal learning is typically studied in two phases. We've got a sensory period where a father's song is memorized, and then a sensory motor period, which is a little later, where the juvenile is practicing to match its memorized song template. That's the classic way of thinking about this. And then by 120 days, we have crystallization, and the zebrafinch isn't going to learn additional songs. But when you look across a lot of studies, you see this overlap. There's a lot of overlap here, this blue box, between sensory and sensory motor periods. And as I just mentioned, if you switch tutors before day 50 or so, this is Lucy Eel's work, sensory and what you'll do is you'll have a bird that learns a new song. So this overlap, to me, is telling me that, like in the baby data, there are opportunities here for social feedback to immature song, which the bird's doing during this time, to actually modify song output or song learning. So this means there's opportunities here for feedback to song in this time period to influence learning. So let me play you a bird song. Zebrafinch song, a lot of you know it. Some of you might not, so I'll just play it. There's several introductory notes followed by a series of syllables that form a motif, and the motif can be repeated anywhere from 1 to 20 times. So here is an example. Very exciting. Okay. Now, that bird has got crystallized songs 120 days post-hatch. Here's the same bird at 39 days. Let me try it one more time. Oh, that's crystal. Sorry. Okay, this is an acoustic nightmare. All right, this is garbage. So people rarely study plastic song. However, like work in brown-headed cowbirds, like our work in human infants, we were wondering if that immature song might be organizing interactions with adults in real time and then creating opportunities for social feedback to song. So we know fathers, we've done work showing that fathers can sing contingently. We also have looked at females, though, and this is directly inspired from the brown-headed cowbird work. It's rarer for songbird song researchers to study females because a lot of these birds, they don't sing. Turns out females do a lot more than singing. Here's an example of a behavior a female will give to a juvenile when it has song that starts to contain more mature elements. It's called a wing stroke. It's very exciting. Okay? See that? Yeah, there's no sound in this one. All right. Let me show you one more time because it's just so exciting. Yeah, not exactly lit up in neon, all right? And this is where actually anthropomorphization gets you in trouble. If you're looking for an obvious warm response, you're not seeing it here. But a songbird can see visual events faster than we can. They have better acoustic temporal resolution as well. And these wing strokes, which are typically about 90 to a couple hundred milliseconds in length, are a form of social feedback that we found in studies of cowbirds get the males to modify their songs to include more mature elements. What's going on in zebrafinch? It turns out they have a few things they can do. So we have three kinds of studies that we do. I have time to tell you about one of them, but I could tell you about others later. We do interactive playback of male song to juveniles. We can do it contingently or non-contingently on plastic song in much the same way we were talking about the infants, except you can't put headphones on dad and say, hey, sing now. So we have to use playbacks to do that. We also can change the brains of infant birds through intracranial injections of neuropeptide hormones, whether it's arginine vasotocin or arginine vasotocin receptor blocker like Manning compound. We can make them more or less receptive to social feedback, and we do linked studies of social bonding and social learning in those birds. And then we have video playback studies, this is one I'll show you right now, where we can actually manipulate the female response behavior. I used to call this bird Skype, but it's not a thing anymore, so I have to call it bird Zoom. And this is work with Samantha Caruso Peck. What we do here is each bird, this is a juvenile male, he's got a monitor displaying feedback behaviors that's connected to a computer that we control. And we do playback during days 40 to 60 post-hatch. Again, that's that period of overlap between the sensory and sensory motor periods when they should be sensitive to social feedback. Here's the design of the study. You have a contingent bird. He sings some plastic song. Very exciting moment. Then what he sees is a video of a female, depending on the condition, doing either a wing stroke or a feather fluff, which is a much longer behavior that they can also do in response to song. At the same time, his brother, they spent the first 30 days together with the same song tutor, his brother also gets that female feedback. So it is synced with the contingent bird song, it is yoked to his brother. So we're controlling for genetic effects. Here's what they sound like after the song is crystallized. So now I'll play more video. I'll stand back so maybe less. Oh, no, that doesn't help. Okay. Why? We're shaping my behavior now. Here is the tutor. Okay, that's the model from the first 30 days. Here's the contingent bird. Pretty good. Here's his brother. Okay, not good. Here's the data. Birds in the contingent playback condition, that's the blue bars on the left, had significantly better song than their yoke-controlled brothers. We have a lot of ways of operationalizing this. This is using Sound Analysis Pro over Chernikovsky's application to look at percent acoustic similarity to tutor. We can actually pair the data because they were brothers, and that we can see that, so our green triangles are yoke birds, blue circles are the contingent brothers, and we can see this is a clear effect of having contingent feedback. We did also look at the amount of singing the birds did while they were in there. So we have 24/7 recordings of these birds. They actually, both the contingent and yoke birds, sang at very similar rates. So this is not an effect of just vocal practice. Okay, it's an effect of the birds' immature sounds, organizing the social environment, creating feedback that's driving learning. So, to sum up, by building a more integrative understanding of social learning, by connecting patterns of social interaction with underlying reward circuitry, we're gaining a much more mechanistic understanding of exactly how social feedback loops of action and interaction that's grounded in these immature vocalizations might have underlying neural feedback loops connecting limbic and cortical regions that can allow for immature vocal behaviors to become elaborated into adaptive and smart systems of vocal communication. And I just want to thank my many undergraduates in my lab. We have a bird team and a baby team, the many graduate students who've been part of this work, the national NIH and NSF for funding of this work, and thank you.